Would you believe me if I told you that for the wives of defeated warriors, survival under the Ottoman Empire was often a fate more terrifying than death itself? Behind the glory of Ottoman conquest and the magnificence of its empire, there was a darker story, one that history often whispers but rarely shouts. The story of women torn from their homes, stripped of their identities and forced into lives where freedom was erased, families destroyed, and humanity reduced to mere spoils of war. Tonight we peel back the glittering facade of empire to expose the shocking fate that awaited these women. Before we dive in, just a quick ask. These videos take a lot of time, research, and care to create. If you're enjoying the journey through these forgotten corners of history, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. It doesn't cost you anything, but it means everything to the channel and helps keep these stories alive. Thank you so much. Enslavement as spoils of war. When an Ottoman army triumphed on the battlefield, the story didn't end with the clash of swords or the fall of a city. For the defeated, the true nightmare began only after the fighting stopped. Victory for the Ottomans meant not only land, wealth, and prestige, it meant human lives. And in the laws and traditions of the time, women and children of the defeated were not recognized as people with rights. They were classified as ganimet, spoils of war. That word, ganimet, carried a weight far heavier than its simple meaning. It reduced wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters into commodities, to be seized, to be distributed, to be sold. Their humanity stripped away the moment their protectors, their husbands, their fathers, their brothers, fell in battle. The battlefield determined the fate of men, but the aftermath determined the fate of families. Under Ottoman practice, captured women and children were treated as rewards for the victors. A soldier who had fought bravely could be given a captive woman as a part of his share of the plunder. To the conquerors, this was framed as just compensation for their service. But to the women themselves, it was a sudden collapse of everything they had known. Freedom, family, dignity, all gone in a single day. Imagine the anguish of a wife who had just seen her husband slain, only to be dragged into the hands of his killer as a part of the spoils. For those not immediately distributed among the soldiers, the next step was even more harrowing. They were marched in groups, sometimes for days, to the great slave markets of the empire. Istanbul, Bursa, Cairo, cities that dazzled visitors with their grandeur and power, also concealed some of the darkest corners of Ottoman life. In these crowded markets, women and children stood waiting to be auctioned like livestock. Eyewitness accounts from European travelers and Ottoman chroniclers alike describe scenes that were chilling. Markets bustling with noise, merchants shouting prices, buyers examining captives, mothers weeping as children were torn from their arms. Historical records tell us that after just one major campaign, thousands of women and children could be paraded into these markets at once. The sheer scale was staggering. Every war fed the system, and every victory swelled the supply of human beings waiting to be bought and sold. To walk into one of those markets was to enter a theater of despair. Imagine the smell, sweat, fear, the stench of unwashed bodies crammed together for days on end. Imagine the sounds, chains clinking, babies crying, the cold voices of men haggling over a human life, as if they were bartering for cloth or grain. For the captives, there was no dignity, no compassion, only the knowledge that their fate now lay entirely in the hands of strangers. And what awaited them after being sold? That depended on who purchased them. Some were destined for households as servants, others for harems, where their lives would be dictated by the whims of their masters. Many would never see their families again. A mother could be sold to one household, her daughter to another, her son to yet another, each branch of the family tree cut and scattered, never to be whole again. One of the most chilling aspects of this system was its normalization. For the Ottomans and for many empires before and after them, this was seen not as an atrocity, but as a natural consequence of war. In official documents, the capture and distribution of women and children were written about in the same matter-of-fact tone as seizing treasure or livestock. This cold, bureaucratic language makes the reality even more haunting. Behind the numbers and records were living, breathing people, people whose names were erased, whose identities were swallowed by the machinery of empire. The scale of this trade was immense. In the 15th through 17th centuries, campaigns into Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and the Caucasus regularly produced floods of captives. Some sources estimate that tens of thousands of women and children were enslaved during particularly large campaigns. The Ottoman state itself sometimes took a cut of the human booty, reserving the most valuable captives for the Sultan's court or for high-ranking officials. In this way, the empire institutionalized the suffering of women, turning their misery into a resource that fueled the Ottoman system. What makes this reality so disturbing is not just the brutality of the practice, but its silence in the grand narratives of history. When we read about the Ottomans, we hear of their dazzling architecture, their military genius, their cultural achievements. But rarely do we hear about the women and children forced into chains, their lives erased in the very moment history celebrates conquest. For the wives of defeated warriors, the fall of their husbands was only the beginning of a deeper tragedy. Their new reality was enslavement, humiliation, and the constant fear of what might come next. They were no longer mothers, daughters, or wives in the eyes of their captors. They were simply Ganymed, plunder, trophies of war, reminders of Ottoman dominance. And so behind every Ottoman victory, behind every expansion of empire, stood an untold story. The story of women marched in chains, of children crying for parents they would never see again, of families torn apart not just by death in battle, but by the calculated cruelty of a system that reduced human lives to spoils. This was the true aftermath of conquest, and for those who lived it, Ottoman triumph was not a tale of glory, but of devastation. Integration into harems or noble households. The fate of women in Ottoman hands was never uniform. Not all were sent to slave markets, not all were handed directly to soldiers. The most beautiful, the most noble-born, or the most skilled were separated from the rest. Their path led somewhere different. Not freedom, not safety, but into the hidden world of the harem. To modern ears, the word harem often conjures up images of luxury, jeweled chambers, silken cushions, and a life of pampered beauty. European travelers of the past helped fuel this fantasy, writing about harems as mysterious places of sensuality and privilege. But behind those veils and walls lay a truth that was far darker. For the women forced into them, the harem was not a paradise. It was a prison cloaked in silk, a place where freedom ended at the door. Once chosen, these women were taken into the harems of the Sultan himself, his relatives, or the highest-ranking Ottoman elites. They were often paraded, examined, and judged by overseers who decided their fate. Their beauty, their age, their skills, even their temperament, determined whether they would be trained as concubines, assigned as entertainers, or relegated to servants. Their bodies and their futures were no longer their own. Every moment of their lives became dictated by rules, surveillance, and the whims of their masters. Inside the harem, nothing was truly private. Women slept, ate, and bathed under the gaze of guards and eunuchs. They were constantly monitored, with strict hierarchies dividing them into ranks. The favored concubines at the top, the lowly servants at the bottom. Ambition and rivalry flourished in this suffocating atmosphere because a woman's only path to survival, or even a shred of influence, was to gain favor with those above her. Conversion to Islam was often expected and in many cases demanded. Names were stripped away, replaced with new ones chosen by their captors. Languages were forgotten as Turkish or Arabic was forced upon them. Traditions and beliefs from their past lives were discouraged, sometimes brutally. Over time, their original identities, their culture, their family ties, Even the sound of their mother tongue dissolved into silence. They were made into something new, not by choice, but by coercion. The outside world romanticized the harem, but within those walls, women endured profound psychological torment. They lived under constant fear of being discarded, punished, or forgotten. Some concubines were elevated to the sultan's bed, but this was no honor. It was an unspoken obligation. Their value depended on pleasing a man they did not choose, and the consequences of refusal or displeasure could mean demotion, abuse, or even disappearance. And yet, in rare cases, a woman's intelligence or charm could change her destiny. The most famous example is Hurrem Sultan, also known as Roxolana. Originally a slave of Ruthenian origin, she captivated Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. Not only did she become his favored concubine, but she eventually became his legal wife, an extraordinary break from tradition, and wielded immense influence in Ottoman politics. Her story, however, is remembered precisely because it was so unusual. For every Hurrem Sultan, there were thousands of nameless women whose lives ended in obscurity, their suffering unrecorded. Most women in harems never saw the outside world again. Their families were lost to them forever. Their futures were confined to gilded walls, their days reduced to routines of obedience and endurance. Entertainment was offered, music, dance, embroidery, but these were distractions, not freedoms. Even laughter in the harem carried the weight of surveillance. It is easy to be deceived by the shimmering surface of history's portrayals. Paintings of harems often show reclining women in fine garments, surrounded by luxury. But those images were not drawn by the women who lived there. They were painted by outsiders, by men who could only imagine the harem as a place of exotic indulgence. The truth was harsher. The silk veils could not hide the chains of captivity. The harem was also a place of calculated control. By stripping women of their identities and enclosing them in opulent prisons, the Ottomans neutralized potential sources of rebellion. These women were too isolated to resist, too dependent to escape, too broken to reclaim the lives they had once known. Their suffering was not a side effect of empire, but part of its design. Imagine the quiet despair. A noble-born woman who once dined in her father's hall, now reduced to serving in silence. A young girl torn from her family, forced to sing or dance for the amusement of strangers. A concubine lying awake at night, knowing that her only worth was tied to a sultan's fleeting desire. The harem was not luxury. It was confinement disguised as beauty. It was assimilation disguised as opportunity. And for the women forced into it, life was not measured in jewels or silks, but in years of silent endurance. A constant reminder that even in the heart of imperial splendor, suffering thrived behind closed doors. This was the hidden fate of many wives and daughters of defeated warriors. Not freedom, not honor, but confinement within walls of wealth that masked their misery. Forced conversion and loss of identity. If enslavement and confinement weren't already devastating enough, there was yet another layer of torment awaiting the women who fell into Ottoman hands. The slow, deliberate erasure of who they once were. Captive wives were not only stripped of their freedom, but often of their very identities. Conversion to Islam was frequently demanded of them, sometimes under pressure, sometimes through unrelenting expectation, and sometimes outright forced. To the Ottomans, a woman who accepted Islam was no longer a prisoner from a defeated people. She was remade into part of their own world. But that transformation came at an immense cost. Her culture, her traditions, and even her name could be taken from her. Imagine the psychological weight of this. A woman might once have been the respected wife of a warrior, a mother, or the daughter of a proud family. Suddenly, she was told that none of that mattered anymore. To survive, she was expected to abandon the gods she had prayed to, the language she had spoken since childhood, the festivals she once celebrated, and the stories passed down through her bloodline. In the eyes of her captors, the old life had to be erased, replaced with the one imposed upon her. And it didn't stop with the women themselves. Children born from these unions were raised entirely within the Ottoman system, under Islamic faith and Ottoman culture. This was no accident. It was a deliberate method of assimilation. By cutting ties to the mother's original culture, the empire ensured that the next generation would grow up loyal not to the defeated, but to the conquerors. It meant the bloodlines of fallen warriors continued, but in a form that no longer resembled their past. The lineage was broken, reshaped to serve the empire's vision of power. The process could be brutal in subtle ways. Names were among the first things to go. Women were renamed to reflect their new faith, often losing the last tangible piece of their old selves. A Christian Katerina might become Fatma. A Slavic Milena could be renamed Aisha. These were not just new labels. They were tools of control, a way to stamp out the identity of the person who had once existed. Over time, as these names were repeated in the harem, in households, and even in official records, the original identity faded until it was little more than a ghost. Language was another weapon of erasure. Captives were often forbidden to speak their native tongue. Within harems and elite households, Turkish, Arabic, or Persian dominated. For women, this meant the sounds of their childhood, lullabies, prayers, conversations with their families, all became forbidden echoes. Children grew up speaking only the language of their masters, not the tongue of their mothers. Even if a woman whispered her native words in secret, there was always the risk of punishment or humiliation if discovered. Slowly, deliberately, entire languages and cultures could be wiped away within a single generation. Conversion also brought cultural dislocation. A woman who had once celebrated the Christian Easter or a Slavic harvest festival would now find herself in a world with completely foreign rituals, feasts, and holy days. Even if she outwardly complied, inside she carried the grief of a severed past, a grief she had no safe place to express. Survival depended on silence. Publicly, she had to conform. Privately, she mourned the loss of her roots, knowing her children would never share them. The Ottomans understood the power of this transformation. By reshaping identity, they weren't simply controlling women, they were controlling memory itself. A captive woman might still breathe, still live, but the life she once had would be systematically dismantled until little of it remained. Her history was swallowed up by the empire, and her descendants, raised as Muslims and Ottomans, would grow further from the culture that was once theirs. This was cultural domination hidden beneath personal suffering. It wasn't only about individual women losing their names or faith. It was about entire communities slowly being erased from history. When enough women were taken, renamed, and converted, their children no longer carried on the songs, the prayers, or the stories of their ancestors. Whole generations disappeared not because they were killed, but because they were reshaped into something unrecognizable. And this erasure was often invisible to the outside world. Unlike public executions or open battles, the transformation of identity happened behind closed doors, within harems and households. There were no monuments recording their original names, no chronicles honoring their true heritage. Instead, what survived in the records were their Ottoman identities, their imposed names, and their children raised in a faith and culture not originally their own. To history, they had already vanished. But if we look closely, we can still trace their absence. In scattered fragments of letters, in rumors recorded by travelers, and in whispers passed down through oral traditions, we glimpse the sorrow of women who lived as shadows of themselves. Their pain was not always marked by bloodshed or visible scars. It was the quieter, more insidious pain of being erased, of being told day after day that who they once were no longer mattered. In many ways, this loss of identity was worse than physical suffering. A beating leaves wounds, but erasing someone's culture, faith, and name leaves them adrift, cut off from every root that gave their life meaning. For the wives of defeated warriors, survival often meant silence and submission. But with each forced conversion, each lost language, each renamed child, another piece of their world was gone forever. This was the hidden tragedy behind Ottoman conquest. Not just the loss of lives, but the loss of entire identities. And though history may have forgotten their names, the silence they left behind still speaks volumes. Separation and family destruction. If enslavement, forced conversion, and loss of identity weren't already unbearable, perhaps the most devastating cruelty of all was the deliberate destruction of families. This was not just a byproduct of war. It was a calculated weapon of control, designed to break both body and spirit. Wives of defeated warriors were torn from their children, sometimes immediately after capture. The separation was not temporary. For most, it was final. A woman might be marched in one direction, toward the slave markets of Istanbul, Bursa, or Cairo, while her sons and daughters were sent in another, swallowed up by systems that ensured they would never return to her arms. Sons, especially strong or promising boys, were often taken into the Devshirme system, one of the most infamous institutions of the Ottoman Empire. This blood tax, as it was sometimes called, saw Christian boys converted to Islam and trained to become janissaries, the Sultan's elite soldiers. To the empire, it was a way of securing loyalty. To the families left behind, it was the cruelest theft imaginable. A mother who had once cradled her child now faced the unbearable reality that her son would grow up as a weapon in the hands of the very power that had destroyed their world. He would be forbidden to return home, forbidden to remember his roots, and molded into a soldier who might one day march against his own people. Daughters faced a different fate, but one no less tragic. Many were given away as gifts to Ottoman officials or sold in markets to fill harems and noble households. Some were sent far across the empire, vanishing into a life of confinement and exploitation. For a mother, the agony was twofold. Not only was she robbed of her daughter's presence, but she knew the child's future was now one of forced assimilation, of being reduced to property in the service of strangers. The laughter of her little girl, the warmth of family bonds, all of it was severed in a single moment, never to be reclaimed. And this was no accident. It was not random cruelty. It was systematic. By tearing apart families, the Ottomans ensured that defeated peoples had no anchor, no unity, and no hope of preserving their culture intact. Mothers left alone without children were easier to control, their grief silencing any thought of rebellion. Children raised within Ottoman systems, whether as janissaries, slaves, or concubines, grew up loyal to the empire, not to the families or nations they had been born into. The result was a devastating cycle of erasure. A captured mother might mourn her son, but she could never write to him, never visit him, never even know if he lived or died. Her daughter, taken to a distant household, would lose her language, her traditions, and perhaps even her name. Over time, the very idea of family was dissolved, not through death alone, but through forced separation that erased lineage, identity, and belonging. Imagine the scene, a battlefield littered with the fallen, and amidst the chaos, the surviving women and children rounded up. A mother clutches her son, only to feel his small hand ripped from hers. She hears his cries fade as soldiers drag him away, her daughter wrenched from her other arm. No matter how she screams, no matter how she begs, no mercy comes. That was the everyday reality for countless wives of defeated warriors. The Ottomans understood the psychological power of this cruelty. A soldier could be killed, but the memory of him lived on through his children. By taking those children and reshaping them into servants of the empire, they destroyed not just one family, but an entire bloodline's chance of continuing in its original form. A warrior's legacy wasn't merely defeated, it was rewritten. And so, the destruction of families became both a punishment and a strategy. It silenced resistance by cutting out its roots. It ensured obedience by replacing loyalty to kin with loyalty to the Sultan, and it left mothers in a state of permanent mourning, haunted by the faces of children they could never hold again. This was the quiet tragedy hidden beneath the grandeur of the Ottoman Empire. History often speaks of its conquests, its palaces, and its armies. But for the wives of the defeated, the true story was one of absence, of children lost, of families shattered, of lineages deliberately broken. Their suffering was not marked by monuments or victories, but by silence, separation, and grief that outlasted even their own lifetimes. In the end, this was perhaps the most devastating wound of all. A beating heals, a scar fades, but the loss of a child, the destruction of family, was a torment that never ended. For the wives of defeated warriors, survival often meant carrying that emptiness every single day, knowing that the world they had once built with their husbands and children was gone forever. Abuse and exploitation. If enslavement, forced conversion, and family separation weren't enough, the nightmare of captivity often entered its darkest stage with abuse and exploitation. For the wives of defeated warriors, survival itself came at a horrifying cost. A life where their bodies, their dignity, and their futures no longer belonged to them. Many women were forced into concubinage, their daily existence reduced to serving the desires of their masters. There was no consent, no choice, no escape. Their humanity was stripped away, replaced by the expectation of obedience and submission. The harem, which to outsiders might sound like a place of luxury and silks, was for these women a cage. Behind its walls, every movement was controlled, every word weighed, every decision made for them by others. Those not chosen as concubines did not escape suffering. If they were deemed less desirable, whether because of their appearance, age, or even their defiance, their fates could be just as cruel. Some were relegated to menial labor, forced to scrub floors, fetch water, or perform endless tasks under harsh conditions. Others faced open humiliation, mocked for their low status, or punished for failing to meet impossible expectations. The idea was not merely to use their labor, but to break their spirits. Physical punishment was a constant threat. Whippings, beatings, and starvation could be used to discipline or intimidate. A woman who resisted or even hesitated could be made an example of before others, her suffering a warning that compliance was the only path to survival. Unlike free women of Ottoman society, enslaved wives had no legal protections. To the system, their pain was invisible, their lives expendable. And yet the abuse extended beyond physical suffering. It was also psychological, designed to erase the very sense of self. Many women were forced to abandon their birth names and adopt new ones chosen by their captors. Their languages, their traditions, and their faiths were stripped away or mocked as inferior. Over time, these women were expected to forget who they once were, to live only as shadows of their former selves. This loss of identity was not accidental. It was deliberate. It was a way to ensure that they never found strength in memory or belonging. The system itself encouraged exploitation. In Ottoman society, the presence of enslaved women was not hidden. It was flaunted. Their captivity became a symbol of conquest, a living reminder of the empire's dominance over defeated peoples. A concubine's beauty might be paraded as proof of victory. A servant's humiliation might reinforce a master's power. Their suffering was not merely tolerated, it was woven into the very fabric of how conquest was celebrated and remembered. The psychological toll of this was immense. Imagine living every day with the knowledge that your body was not your own, that your worth depended only on someone else's whims. Imagine the terror of knowing that refusal could bring punishment, and compliance meant the loss of your dignity. For many women, survival meant silence, biting back words, hiding tears, enduring in ways that could never be spoken aloud. Even worse, their exploitation often outlasted their youth. Once a woman was no longer considered beautiful or useful, she could be cast aside. Some were sold again, passed from one household to another like property. Others were neglected, left to fade away in obscurity. To the system, they had already served their purpose. Their lives, like those of so many others, were measured not in years but in the value they could provide to someone else's pleasure or power. This was the darkest layer of their fate. To live, but to live without autonomy, without dignity, and without hope. Their exploitation was not just personal, it was political. Every act of abuse reinforced the Ottoman hierarchy, reminding both captives and subjects alike that the empire's power was absolute. Their pain became a tool of domination, a message carved into human lives. Conquest did not just claim land, it consumed people. In the end, the wives of defeated warriors endured a torment that was as much about erasure as it was about survival. Their suffering was hidden behind palace walls and household doors, unrecorded in official chronicles, but etched deeply into the silence of history. They remind us that beneath the grandeur of empires, behind the victories celebrated in stone and story, there was another truth. A truth of stolen dignity, broken spirits, and lives reduced to shadows. When we hear about the grandeur of the Ottoman Empire, the domes and minarets piercing the sky, the wealth flowing through Istanbul's markets, the power of its sultans who commanded fear across continents, it is easy to be swept away by the glory of conquest. History books often praise the victories, the strategy, and the culture that flourished under Ottoman rule. But behind the shining surface, there was a hidden cost, one paid not in gold or marble, but in the lives of the conquered. For the wives of defeated warriors, every Ottoman triumph was a personal catastrophe. While the empire expanded, their worlds collapsed. They were not remembered as victors or builders of history, but as captives who bore the deepest scars of war. Their suffering came in many forms: enslavement, forced conversion, separation from children, and endless exploitation. Each victory that the empire celebrated was, for them, the beginning of a nightmare without escape. Imagine watching armies march into your homeland, not only claiming the soil beneath your feet, but also tearing apart the very fabric of your family. Imagine being forced into a world where your name, your language, and your faith were stripped away, where your children no longer belonged to you, and where your dignity was treated as something expendable. For these women, survival did not mean freedom. It meant enduring a fate worse than death, one where every day was a reminder that they were no longer their own. So when we speak of the Ottoman legacy, we must remember both sides of history. The empire left behind grand mosques and powerful rulers, yes, but also broken families, lost identities, and silenced lives. Tonight we have remembered not the conquerors, but the conquered. And in their silence, we hear the echo of a truth that history too often forgets: that every empire is built not only on triumphs, but on tragedies. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. We know these are not easy stories to hear, and we deeply appreciate you joining us on this exploration of history's darker corners. If you found this video insightful, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with others who are interested in untold history, and subscribing to the channel to make sure you don't miss our next chapter. Thank you, and see you in the next episode of Dark Lore.